It's 4 o'clock. Everybody, thank you very much for joining us on today's presentation. Great fun presentation that you hear. A lot of great tips and information. Just wanted to remind everybody that this session will be recorded. All attendees will be muted, but keep in mind there is that Q&A on the bottom of your screen. You could type your questions there and we'll be answering as we go through the presentation. There's also going to be a lot of fun poll questions that I hope you can participate in, and there's also at the end of this presentation I'll mention some of the as we go through you'll see right now some of the future presentations coming up in the future. So you'll see next week we have sustainability at the library, and that's a great program. We have a new great education outreach there that you could check out. A lot of great materials there, kits to help you determine how efficient you are at your home. And then we following and next week as well, we'll have a couple of other presentations on energy efficiency standards. They're a little bit more technical, but they're also very informative. And I hopefully you could join us for those as well. As you can see there, explore common construction assemblies and identify best practices, pitfalls, and solutions. So it's great information for the more technical, but it's still good information to learn. And it's September 22nd from noon to 1 o'clock. It's a short one. So hopefully you could join us for both of those seminars upcoming. And again, please feel free to use the Q&A there, and we'll be able to answer those questions as we move along. So this presentation today, really important. Food waste is an issue that it plagues this country and the rest of the world, but this country being I say our focus at this point. The EPA estimates that in 2017, in the United States, more food reached landfills and combustion facilities than any other single material in our everyday trash. So it's a 22% of that amount was landfilled and or was combusted, because there's places where they do that as well. So reducing our food waste will help the U.S. address climate change because when it goes in the landfills, it accounts for 20%. Or 20% of our total methane emissions come from landfills. So that's a pretty big chunk of emissions there out of our total. So I think a really big point as well is that we're keeping wholesome and nutritious food out of our communities. So by saving this food, we could address and this again, it was from 2017 per the EPA, the 42 million Americans that live in food insecure households. So I'm sure after this pandemic, that number has grown exponentially. So Sarah is here she's here to help us and understand what's going on with food waste and how we could help this problem, how we could help and find a solution and as much we could do as much as we can. So I'll let Sarah kick it off, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Great. Thank you so much, Manuel, for the introduction. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for this presentation. Like Manuel mentioned, my name is Sarah. I work as the program coordinator of the Wasted Food Prevention Program with the San Diego Food System Alliance. So in my day-to-day work, I work on all things food waste. And I'm really excited to join all of you to talk a little bit more about food waste and really identify some tips, tricks, and strategies that we can all implement in our everyday lives to kind of make an impact on the issue of food waste. Next slide. So before kind of jumping into all of that fun material and jumping into food waste, I did want to share just a little bit more about the San Diego Food System Alliance, as well as the work that we do. Next slide. So the San Diego Food System Alliance is a powerful network of over 150 multi-sector organizations that are really committed to cultivating a healthy, sustainable, and just food system here in San Diego County. So together, we're really working to support our local farmers and fishermen to ensure that low-income communities have access to healthy, quality food, and that nothing is wasted in the system of food, particularly here in this region. So we're really committed to the community in San Diego. And the way that we do all of this kind of complex work is really in three ways. First, we promote collaboration across sectors. Second, we influence public policy. And third, we influence consumers as well as institutions to really catalyze long-lasting changes. Next slide. And with that, we want to jump right into talking about trash or talking about food waste. Next slide. So with this image, we like to say that this is quite literally America's pie chart when we talk about food waste in the United States. So 40% of all food in the United States is actually wasted or ends up in the trash. And when we talk about food waste, we're talking about any food that's grown and produced for the purposes of human consumption, but for a variety of reasons is ultimately not eaten and instead finds its way, like Manuel mentioned, in landfill. So an analogy that we kind of like to use to make sense of what this really means is imagine yourself, having just gone to the grocery store and you bought 5 full bags of groceries. You're walking back to your car, and while you're in the parking lot, you drop 2 of those bags. But instead of picking them up, you leave them there and you just make your way to your car. That's essentially what we're doing in our homes today when we're talking about 40% of food being wasted. So I know this is kind of a virtual, presentation, but I still want to be engaged with all of you here on the call. So we have a couple of poll questions interspersed throughout the presentation to hear from you. And the first one here is really to ask all of you to maybe reflect on your own food waste at home, particularly since, the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we've all been following the shelter in place or stay at home orders. What does food waste look like in your own home? Do you feel like you're wasting more food than normal? Are you wasting maybe less food than you were before? Or maybe you're wasting about the same. But maybe just take a second to think about that and then put your answer in. All right, thank you all so much for participating in that. So like I mentioned, there's going to be a couple more kind of fun options. So it looks like most people have marked that they're wasting less food since the start of the pandemic or stay-at-home orders, which is awesome. And then the other 33% are wasting about the same. So no one's wasting more food, which is fantastic. For folks that mark that they're wasting less, I'm hoping that maybe you can share some of the things that are working for you, maybe in the Q&A or while we're going through some of the tips. And if you're wasting about the same, I hope that the tips and tricks that we go over in the rest of the presentation, that there are some that really stick out to you that you can implement in your daily routine. So thanks again for participating in that, and there'll be more fun questions as we go along. Next slide. So really thinking about, well, where is this food waste coming from? At the San Diego Food System Alliance, we really like to take a food systems perspective for all the work that we do, and food waste is no exception. So really looking here at the food system, we can see that food waste is really being generated at all levels of the food system. So starting from production, going through manufacturing. But what really stands out from this graphic is that the greatest generators of food waste are very heavily skewed to the right of this graphic. So 70% of all food that is wasted is actually being generated by commercial kitchens. So you can think about hotels, restaurants, things like that, and households. And at 43%, households are actually taking that #1 slot in terms of the greatest generators of food waste. And that may seem kind of a daunting or even a little bit of a depressing kind of fact, but I think this also is a huge testament to the power that we have with our kind of individual actions, or the way that consumer actions can really influence food waste. And that's going to be a theme as we continue these conversations on what we can all do in our homes to make an impact on the issue of food waste. Next slide. So the follow-up question to this is, well, why does this matter? Why should someone care about food waste? Wasting the food in and of itself is a problem, and we can talk about that. But we also like to talk about the idea that wasting food is also wasting all of the resources that went into producing that food, whether it's land, water, energy, all of that is also wasted every time something ends up in the trash. And we've kind of broken out here on the slide 3 primary impacts of food waste. So the first is really looking at the economic impacts of food waste, or the financial costs that it has not only on us as consumers, but actually on the entire industry. And ReFed, which is a regional kind of think tank on the issue of food waste, estimates that the total dollar value of wasted food in the United States is about $218 billion, which is a staggering number. And if we just think back to the previous slide, at 43%, as households are the greatest generators of food waste, we're also then kind of paying the highest price for all of this food being wasted. So thinking about this idea of the financial cost of food waste, we have another poll question here for you. So let's think about a family of 4 here in the US. How much do you think a family of 4 on average spends every year on food that ends up in the trash or ends up being wasted? So go ahead and either take a guess or maybe an answer, and then we'll review the results. Awesome. So you all got it. It is the second answer choice, $1,500. So $1,500 per year, a family of 4 is spending on food that's ending up in the trash. And I'm sure if we all had an opportunity to say what we'd like to do with $1,500, we'd come up with a lot of different ideas. So the next impact category, kind of moving from this conversation about the economic impacts, are really, the environmental impacts of food waste. And when we consider the impact that it has on climate change, so like Manuel kind of alluded to in the introduction of this presentation, when food just sits in landfill, it's rotting and it's producing methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas that is actually more harmful to the environment than carbon dioxide. And if we kind of take a global perspective on this issue, and we could represent food waste as its own country in terms of its greenhouse gas emissions, it would actually be considered the 3rd largest greenhouse gas emitter after China and the United States. So there's really an argument to be made here between the direct relationship between wasting food and the impacts that it has on our environment and on climate change. And then lastly, there's the social impacts of food waste, and really what throwing away food means when food insecurity is also a prevalent issue in our communities. So at the same time that we're throwing away 40% of all of our food, there are members of our community that are going to sleep hungry or who don't know where their next meal is coming from. I mean, here in San Diego County, specifically prior to COVID-19, 1 in 7 San Diegans, which is almost 500,000 people, were considered food insecure. And like Manuel mentioned, that number has just skyrocketed, and we've seen the need really increase. September actually specifically is Hunger Action Month. So there's a huge public awareness campaign going on right now about the issue of hunger. And it's almost a little bit crazy to think about, food waste and food insecurity almost, coexisting at the same time. Next slide. So from all of that, we're hoping that you're asking yourselves, well, what can I do about this? And the answer is actually that there's a lot that we can do. So the image that you see here on your screen right now is actually a poster from 1917 that really outlines these 6 different strategies for how you can reduce food waste at home. And we think this is cool for a lot of different reasons. But one of the biggest reasons is, in the course of our work, we hear a lot that, food waste is just a hot topic right now, or it's something that people are only just starting to talk about or integrate into these conversations about sustainability. But what this is really showing is that over 100 years ago, that food waste was part of the conversation. This was something that people cared about, and that there were specific strategies being outlined for folks to kind of make changes at home or in their kitchens. So we were really inspired by this, and kind of in 2020 wanted to reimagine what food waste reduction strategies could look like today. And so we've come up with kind of the 4 categories that you see listed to the right of this poster. So smart grocery shopping, zero waste cooking, meal planning, and then proper food storage. And what we'll be doing for the rest of the presentation is kind of taking a deep dive into each one of these categories, and looking at some of the tips that we can all implement. Next slide.
Sarah, we have a question.
Oh, sure.
So the question is, if fruits and veggies in your refrigerator or pantry spoil, and if you put them in your composter, does the to make compost, does this count as food waste?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it would not. So when we're talking about food waste, we're talking about food that's ending up in landfill. What you're describing, composting, is what's called the diversion strategy. So it's a way to prevent that food from ending up in landfill. The EPA actually has an entire what's called a food recovery hierarchy, and it outlines different strategies for diverting food waste from ending up in landfill. Composting is one of them. And what's great about this hierarchy is that the solutions at the top of this pyramid are actually the ones that are most recommended or have the biggest impact, and that's source reduction. So preventing food waste from even being created or happening in the first place, which is what we're focusing on kind of with these tips that we'll be outlining. But certainly composting is a way to prevent that food waste from going to landfill, and then compost can be a great addition to soils and can be kind of put back into the earth. So hope that answers your question. If not, feel free to follow up with another question or comment.
Thanks, Sarah.
Mm-hmm. Great. So kind of jumping into these tips, the first one that we want to start with is smart grocery shopping. So, before we even talk about, our kitchens or cooking tips, food waste is really starting with what we're putting in our our carts and what we're doing in the grocery store. So thinking of strategies or ways that we can prevent food waste from having, even at that stage, can be a great way to become kind of a food waste warrior. Next slide. So the way that grocery stores are designed are to kind of tempt you in every aisle. The ultimate goal of the grocery store is to get you to buy more food or to buy more so that they can maximize their profits. And maybe that's how we end up coming home with a lot of things that we weren't planning on purchasing when we first got to the grocery store. So something as simple as just making a shopping list or a grocery list can help you stay on track and make sure that you're only purchasing or only picking up the items that you have put on that list. And kind of a step further from that, and what's even better, is to shop with very specific recipes in mind. So doing that actually challenges you to have a plan for how you'll use the ingredients or use the food items that you're picking up from the grocery store, rather than kind of buying a bunch of maybe random things, sticking them in the refrigerator or the pantry when you get home, and then not really knowing how you'll use it before you go to the grocery store again, maybe in 2 weeks. So creating that grocery list, even if it's on pen and paper, or there are a lot of great apps out there that you can use if you want to create shared grocery lists with your family or with the roommates, can be a great way of making sure that you're not over purchasing at the store. The second tip here is one I think we can all really appreciate, which is making sure that you eat before going grocery shopping. So there was actually a study that found that people who shop on an empty stomach or who shop when they're hungry actually spend 64% more than shoppers who are not hungry. So I mean, I can speak at least on my behalf. When you're hungry and you go to the grocery store, everything will look good and things will end up in your cart that maybe you weren't planning on purchasing that day. So, if you want to prevent some of those unaccounted for purchases or items in your cart, just make sure that you eat a snack before you head out to the grocery store. The third tip here about supporting imperfection. So I know that when we go to the grocery store, we're very used to seeing kind of these displays of perfect fruits and vegetables, the oranges that are all the same size, the lemons that have no blemishes on them. But really, in nature, food doesn't grow that way. And we talk a lot, kind of in the food waste world, about what's called imperfect produce. And you can kind of see in the picture on the screen here on the bottom left, these are really, fruits, vegetables, items that are perfectly fine in their nutritional value and their safety, but they look a little bit different than what we're typically used to seeing in a store. So the carrot that has an extra leg, the strawberry that's a little bit twisted. And what ends up happening is people see food that looks like this and think that it's bad because it doesn't adhere to this kind of perfect standard. And a lot of grocery stores actually will refuse to stock even this type of food. Only because it's too ugly to put on a shelf. Again, nothing wrong with its nutritional value. So maybe supporting some of these imperfect foods. If we see, a lemon that looks a little bit different or a carrot that, isn't the same size as the other ones, taking a chance on that food item. And actually, a lot of times you can ask grocery store managers if they have imperfect produce on hand, and sometimes they will sell it to consumers at discounted rates. And there's also subscription services where you can have kind of a CSA type box or a box of imperfect produce or imperfect food delivered directly to you. So that's also a great way to kind of combat food waste. And then lastly here, we talk a lot about making sure that we can understand date labels. And there's really a lot of confusion out there about date labels. And one thing that's important to note here is that date labels on food are actually not federally regulated. These are actually dates that are developed by food manufacturers, and they're really indicating quality, not food safety. And because there's kind of a variety of ways or different wording that you see with date labels, so sell by, use by, best before, better if used by. It really kind of only adds to the confusion as to what all of that means. The only food that is federally regulated for food safety is actually baby food. So if you're not looking at baby food, really at the end of the day, what we like to say is use your judgment and your best senses to determine if food has gone bad, rather than only relying on the date that's printed on the package or on the can. Next slide. So now we want to move into the idea of zero waste cooking. A lot of times, when we're in a rush trying to prepare a meal, food waste isn't always what's really top of mind, right? We're probably more concerned with, I need to get a meal on the table as quickly as possible. And especially with COVID-19 and all of us staying at home, I know for myself, I've been doing a lot more cooking. So really integrating some of these zero waste cooking tips can be a helpful way to make sure that I'm not generating a lot of waste while I'm cooking. Next slide. So the first tip here is what we call swap this for that, or really what's referring to ingredient substitutions. So let's say you're following a specific recipe for dinner and it calls for an ingredient that you don't have. Rather than either driving all the way to the store to try to buy that ingredient or not making the recipe altogether, you can actually find that you have something either in your pantry or your fridge that can be used as a great substitution for that ingredient. So, as a personal example, this past weekend, I really wanted pancakes. And the recipe that I was following called for milk, which we had just run out of, so I didn't have any milk in my fridge. But what I did have was some half and half cream that I knew I probably wasn't going to be using anytime soon. And it had been in the fridge for a while. So a quick kind of Google search taught me that adding a little bit of water to your half and half cream can make it a great substitution for milk in recipes. So really using this idea of ingredient substitutions can be a great way of not only you can save the recipe that you're cooking, but also saving some small things in your pantry or fridge that maybe would have otherwise gone unused, and you're repurposing them into something, into a meal or into a recipe. The second tip here is about repurposing leftovers. So I know a lot of times we think of leftovers as sad, or no one wants the leftovers, and it's something that just kind of gets shoved around in the fridge or in the freezer. But really, with a little bit of creativity, you can repurpose your leftovers into a new and really exciting meal. So the picture that you see in the top right-hand corner of your screen, that's actually a fried rice that was made out of some leftover brown rice, and then the stalks of a broccoli. So usually people only use the tops, and then the stalks get thrown out, but this person, tossed it into their stir fry. So finding ways to repurpose some items can kind of give new life to your leftovers. The third tip here is reviving limpy produce. So, a lot of times you might have found yourself reaching for some lettuce or some carrots that were in your fridge, and you pull it out and you realize that they're just so wilted and soft and not really in the prime that you first bought them at. And your first instinct might be, okay, well, I'm going to throw this away because I can't use it in my salad anymore. But there is actually a way to save them. So if you just get a bowl and fill it with ice and place that wilted lettuce in some ice water and leave it for a little bit, it can actually crisp right back up and look the same as when you bought it from the store. So don't give up on your kind of wilted or limpy produce or fruits, but try putting it in an ice bath, and it can actually bounce back and be delicious in your food. And then lastly, we talk about saving peels and scraps. A lot of times with cooking, the greatest waste that's being generated is kind of the peels of maybe a potato or the skin of an onion, or what we call trim waste when we're cooking, and oftentimes that just all gets thrown in the trash because it's not going in your meal. But there are ways that you can actually repurpose or use those scraps and turn them into something that is edible. So in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen here is a picture actually of a veggie stock. So something I like to do is keeping a big Ziploc bag on hand. And if I'm cutting an onion or chopping a carrot, or I have kind of the end of a celery left over, I don't throw it away. I actually put it in the Ziploc bag that I toss in the freezer so that it doesn't really smell out on my counter. And when I've accumulated enough veggie scraps, you can actually make your own veggie stock or broth. And a lot of times it can be even more delicious than the ones that you buy from the store. So you can really create new meals with that. Or in the case of the picture in the top left-hand corner of your screen, that's a pesto that's actually made out of the tops of the carrots. So usually people don't think about eating carrot greens, but you can actually create and make them into a pesto. Next slide.
Hey, Sarah, could you suggest any websites, good websites with leftover recipes or any tips like that?
Yeah, there is actually a great resource website called I Value Food, and it has an entire section on kind of repurposing leftovers, or how to kind of, I think the article name is What to Do with Lonely Leftovers. So it gives some kind of great suggestions for what you can do with leftovers you may have on hand. The Save the Food website is also a good one. It has some cool recipes for folks that are looking to challenge themselves with some kind of zero waste cooking. So I would recommend starting off with those two.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. So in the world of food waste, we really like to say that the freezer is your friend, and especially when it comes to meal planning, which is our next tip category. So about 1/3 of all household food waste is actually caused by people, preparing too much food and then not eating it, or not having a plan to eat it. So really, meal planning can be a great way of kind of making sure that you're not generating too much food waste in your kitchen. Next slide. So using the freezer almost as a pause button, whether it's for your fresh fruits or vegetables that, if you leave them in your fridge, they're just going to go bad before you have a chance to use them. Or if you're cooking in bulk and want to save part of that meal that you can then pull out for a quick weekday meal. Using the freezer is a great way of just preserving your food and having a plan for using it at some point in the future instead of just leaving it in your fridge until it goes bad. The second tip here, kind of similar to what we talked about with grocery shopping, planning your meals with specific recipes in mind. It really helps to have a plan for how you'll use your ingredients instead of, forgetting about those ingredients in the back of your fridge. So kind of taking an inventory, seeing what you have in your fridge, in your pantry, what you're planning on purchasing that week, and then developing your recipes around those items. So kind of speaking to the idea of forgetting about things in the back of your fridge, I'm sure we've all been there when you're maybe looking for the mayonnaise and then you're digging around the back of your fridge and you find a pack of strawberries that somehow got pushed all the way to the back and forgotten, and now they have mold all over them and you have to toss them out. So one way that we like to kind of advocate for preventing that from happening is creating what's called an Eat Me First section of your fridge. So that's kind of the picture you see on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. It can be either a box like the picture is showing, or even just a section on your on your shelf. But it's really an area of your fridge where you're putting all of the items that you either know are going to go bad quickly or that have just been in your fridge for a while and need to be used up. It can be a great kind of visual reminder every time you open your fridge of, okay, I need to use these items up first before maybe some of the things that I've just purchased or that are going to have a longer shelf life in your fridge. So, creating that box or that section in your fridge can be a great way of using up those ingredients. And then lastly, in your meal planning routine, designate one of your meals or one night a week to be kind of an eat the leftovers night. So especially now that we're all staying at home, maybe cooking every day is really tiring, or maybe it's something that we're not able to do. So having one day where you know that you're going to pull out the leftovers from your fridge or your freezer can kind of alleviate some of the burden on ourselves from having to figure out what to cook that day or having to cook at all. But also, again, to the idea of using up our leftovers and treating them as still good food rather than just forgetting about them and kind of throwing them away after a few days. You can kind of call it a leftover smorgasbord or almost like a little buffet of lots of different foods. So creating some excitement around it as well can be a good strategy. Next slide. And our last category of tips is really about proper food storage. And this is one of the best ways to fight food waste, is to actually store food correctly. Right now with COVID-19, we're all probably trying to limit our trips to the grocery store. So storing our food properly and making sure it stays fresh for longer is really going to help us kind of with that goal. And what's interesting about food storage is a lot of times the ways that we purchase food in the grocery store, or the way that we bring it home, is not actually the best way or the proper way to be storing it. So in the example of the cilantro that you see here on the screen, if you get it from the grocery store, you'll kind of pick it up in that single-use plastic bag. But the best way to store cilantro is actually to get a jar, fill it up with a little bit of water, and then put the cilantro in that jar the same way that you would put, flowers in a vase. You'll find that actually it's going to last a lot longer on the top shelf of your fridge than if you left it in the plastic bag and threw it in the crisper drawer. With strawberries or other berries, we often buy them kind of, really tightly packed in these plastic containers. But the best way to store strawberries is actually taking them out and putting them in layers between paper towels to really help prevent kind of moisture from accumulating on them, which can lead to mold. And as a general tip kind of related to this is really to avoid washing your fruits and vegetables until you're ready to eat them. If you pre-wash them and then put them in the refrigerator when they still have water on them, that's just going to be a breeding ground for mold. And that's how you end up finding, moldy strawberries in the fridge. So just a quick tip on that. With whole grain flours and nuts, those are actually best stored in the freezer. Specifically with nuts, a lot of nuts tend to have a high fat content. And especially if you're buying them in bulk or you have just a large quantity of them, if you leave them out for a long time, they can actually tend to go bad because of that high fat content. So storing them in the freezer and then pulling them out when you need can be a great way to just keep them fresh. Apples are actually best stored in the refrigerator. Often people will put them, on their kitchen counter or maybe in a bowl on the dining table. But apples do have a tendency to ripen up to 10 times faster if they're left at room temperature. So if you know that you're not going to be using them up immediately, putting them in the fridge will help keep them fresh for longer. If you have any extra butter kind of lying around that you know you're not going to be using, throwing it in the freezer can be a great way of preserving it, and it'll be perfectly fine to use when you pull it out. And then finally, with milk, a lot of folks, actually store milk in the door of their refrigerator, likely because it fits really nicely there, or if you're eating or cooking with it a lot, it's easily accessible. But what a lot of people don't realize is that the door of your fridge is actually the warmest part. And leaving your milk there can actually cause it to spoil, maybe soon after you bought it. A lot of times people will notice that their milk has a funky smell, even well before the date that's printed on the label or from when they bought it. So make sure that you're storing your milk in the main compartment of your fridge and not putting it in the door. Next slide. So that kind of, is the overview of all of our food waste reduction tips. And what I have here on the slide is the name of our kind of food waste education campaign, which we call Save the Food San Diego. And really presenting it here as a call to action to all of you, that really small changes to our daily habits can make a difference in reducing food waste. I know with a lot of these, they seem like they're common sense or they seem so simple, but really challenging ourselves to implement even one or two and watching how that changes our own waste habits at home can be really amazing. So I'm really hoping that you all took something away from this presentation and that there were some strategies that stood out to you that you'd like to implement in your own homes. So as a kind of final poll question for all of you, was curious to hear maybe which of the following, tip categories will you try implementing at home, whether it's the smart grocery shopping tips, the zero waste cooking, meal planning, storing your food properly, or if you're inspired by all of them, you can actually pick more than one option. So would love to just hear from all of you. Great. So it looks like all of the above seems like a popular option. That's amazing, as well as proper food storage. So really hoping that, again, that some of these that you'll take with you and implement in your own homes. And even if it's just starting with one or two and then building up more strategies over time. Next slide. And with that, I'll go ahead and conclude my presentation. Thank you so much to all of you for your time. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them now.
Thank you very much, Sarah. We do have a question, and I'll start out. It says, isn't it part of the problem also that food is sold in bunches, bags, and boxes that give you more that you really can't consume before they're going bad? Why can't we buy things in smaller quantities?
That's a great question. I do think that it is part of the problem, right? The way that bulk purchasing or wholesale purchasing right now is really becoming something that's common. Especially if you're a smaller household or you know that you can't go through all of that food by the time it goes bad, it makes it really difficult to kind of manage that inventory or make sure it doesn't go bad. There are things that we can do to kind of buy things in smaller quantities or quantities that are more manageable for your household. So if you're a regular shopper at like a big wholesale retailer or a store that sells things in bulk packaging, there are other kind of grocery stores or other vendors that do sell things are more on like an individual basis. So, farmers markets are a great way of kind of, you can control maybe how much you're getting of a certain item. Smaller grocery stores tend to package things in smaller packages. So identifying, which food items you're not going to be using too much of, and then maybe not purchasing those from a wholesale retailer. Or, if that's more economical for your family, or that's something that's easier, find ways to make sure that you can maybe store part of it either in the freezer or in a way that'll preserve its life a little bit longer. An example of that is my family buys from Costco like the huge bag of spinach. And what they do is half of it they put in the freezer to cook with later on or to throw in soups. And then the other half that's put in the fridge is used more for salads and things that are fresh. So just a suggestion for a strategy for that.
Great tips. Thank you. Another question we have on here. I'm wondering about the amount of food waste at restaurants. Portion sizes are too big, and many people don't take the uneaten food home. Are there figures showing how much food is wasted in restaurants?
Yeah, another great question. So thinking back to that kind of graphic that I had showing where food waste is coming from different stages in the food system, commercial kitchens, which do encompass restaurants, are the second greatest generators of food waste. So households are the 43%, commercial kitchens are the other kind of 27 to make up this 70% of food waste being generated. So, there is food waste that is coming from restaurants due to overproduction, particularly if it's a buffet style restaurant. Like this question mentions, portion sizes, whether folks are actually, if there's a culture of reducing food waste in that kitchen, and patrons are encouraged to take their food home with them or not. So that's definitely part of the conversation. I think one thing that we can do as consumers in this case is not being afraid to ask for a to-go box, even if you're out with friends or with family and no one else is doing it. Starting to kind of have this culture shift of, it's okay to take back something that I didn't finish so that I can eat it the next day, so that I make sure that it doesn't get wasted. Or even asking for half portions at restaurants. A lot of times there's this kind of culture of, especially in this country, of providing a lot of food on the plate is a symbol of generosity. But it's fine to say, can I get a half portion, to make sure that you're not wasting any of that food if you don't want to take anything with you. So there are ways that we can do our part when we go out to restaurants or we eat out, to make sure that we're not generating that waste. And then within the San Diego Food System Alliance, on our wasted food prevention programming, we do a lot of work with institutional kitchens and working with them on how they can reduce their food waste, kind of on the back end or on the kitchen side.
Great, thank you. Folks, I encourage you, if you have any questions, we have a little bit more time. So I have a question myself too. Sarah,
Sure.
how can we as consumers have our voices heard from the food producers? What would you recommend?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, like I mentioned before, kind of this culture shift around food waste, and there's this parallel often that's drawn between, if someone were to throw trash on the street, we would all kind of have a collective gasp, or we would all be shocked that someone can do that, because throwing trash in the street or littering is no longer something that's socially acceptable, right? That same kind of cultural understanding among people doesn't exist, right? No one really flinches when food is thrown away. So I think on the one side, we as consumers really need to push this culture shift where we really are, demonstrate that we're not okay with food being wasted, that it's something that is as shocking or as wrong as throwing trash in the street. I think that a lot of kind of at the higher level, a lot of decisions and systems are informed by those kind of individual consumer perceptions. So that can be a great way of shifting the narrative, kind of almost in a grassroots fashion, right? Changing the way that we see and treat food waste. And then I think related even to the question about restaurants, asking for half portions, or even asking, if you're planning an event and you're working with a caterer, asking them what is their plan for excess food, or what do they do with food waste, just to make sure that are these businesses or caterers, are they being held accountable to this zero waste standard? So I think those are some small ways that we can start kind of shifting that narrative.
I see a comment here from somebody that's mentioning there's a questions in the presenter and host box. I just cannot see them. Yasmin, can you help with that? Oh, here we go.
I'm checking.
Okay. Well, meanwhile, we have another question. And it's when home composting in an outdoor compost heap, should I be concerned with methane gas release? And I could answer that question, and not really. You want to have a system, if it's working properly, that has enough air circulation that methane gas wouldn't really be captured. So, in any other questions related to compost, I suggest if you could send us at environmental services at chulavistaca.gov, and we could help you with that. There's also courses that you could take now online that will help you with some of those questions too. We have another question here. Kids grow up seeing lots of food waste. School cafeterias, oh my gosh, that's true. They throw away a lot of food. How can we educate kids differently?
Yeah, another great question. I mean, just speaking to kind of our work with the Wasted Food Prevention Program and kind of our regional consumer education around food waste, working with schools is definitely a goal that we have, and particularly with this idea of kind of school cafeterias or school nutrition services. I will say that there are some best practices that are emerging around the idea of minimizing food waste at schools. So San Diego Unified, I think, was successful in this strategy, but setting up what's called share tables. So it allows children who, if they have, unwanted food items from their lunch, instead of throwing it away, they can actually, put it on this what's called share table, and then other students can come and kind of pick up food from that table if they're interested. And it's a way to kind of encourage them not to throw, whole uneaten food in the trash, and instead, put it on this share table. With COVID-19 and all of the changes that are going to be happening, in schools, I think it remains to be seen whether that's something that will be continuing. But prior to COVID-19, I do know that that was a strategy that was being implemented in schools. And then there are some kind of state agencies that have some great resources around education for kids around the issue of food waste. So Stop Waste is actually a initiative County, so Northern California, and they have some really great resources for kids. And one of my favorites is kind of this action comic book called The Amazing Garbologist. And it's kind of all about the issue of food waste and this fun, very child-friendly language and activities. So I think that there is emerging work and education campaigns coming out around how do we integrate food waste education within schools. And I think what's going to be interesting moving forward is seeing how COVID-19 and kind of the safety precautions as kids go back to school, how that's really going to shape that conversation.
There was another question asking here, does everyone have a to-go food container distributed in the city? Maybe whomever posted that question could clarify. But we have another question here. What's the latest on the food waste recycling program? Putting out your food waste curbside along with your yard waste recycling. So that is the case. I could answer that question. We're working on a program that's going to be compliant with a state rule that calls for food waste and organic waste diversion from landfill by January 1st, 2022. So that is what we're working on to be able for Chula Vista residents to be able to put their food waste in their yard waste cart. And if you don't have a cart, then part of the program will be to provide one for you at no extra cost. So and speaking of cost, yes, there is going to be an increased cost to this program because now we're not burying the organics, we're actually composting them, and there is an additional cost to simply landfilling them. And yes, unfortunately, it will incur a little bit of an increase on your trash service, but it'd be really convenient to be able to just put it in your yard waste cart, and then your yard waste. If you do have a yard waste cart now, or when we adopt this program, that rental fee will go away. So that's another good thing that you won't have to pay. So if you think about whatever increase happens, minus that 150 a month that you pay, that you're not really looking at a big increase to be able to have the ability to do that. So it's on its way. Keep an eye out for a lot of the information we'll be sending out to our residents and to our businesses as well. So I think the question on the to-go container, see, I see it here. We did have a program where we were distributing reusable to-go containers at different restaurants along Third Avenue. We had them at different restaurant areas or districts, as we could call them, throughout the city. And that program, it actually came to a conclusion last year at the end of 2019, and we're hopes to renew it. But unfortunately, COVID hit, and there's very fact, I don't think you could even you're probably not allowed to bring in a to-go container, a reusable to-go container. But once we're on the clear of all this, we want to bring this back to encourage the use of to discourage the use of styrofoam and encourage the use of reusables, and then and taking home your food waste so you could store it and eat it as leftovers and not waste it. Great. So that's where that question was. Any other questions we see there on the? So I want to be respectful of everybody's time. And if there are any more questions, we're about 6 minutes away. Oh, here's another question. You can opt out of future food scraps waste program. Can you opt out of future food scrap program if you're composting at home? And unfortunately, it looks like you might not be able to, because remember, home composting, you can only compost vegetative food waste. You have to have a pretty sophisticated system to also compost meats and bones and stuff like that. So the program that we're proposing, and that has to be state compliant, will allow you to compost or to put any the vegetative food waste, but also any meats, any other stuff that that you wouldn't normally put on your home composting. So that is the answer to that. And unfortunately, you wouldn't be able to opt out if you're composting at home. So let's see, any other questions here? Thank you. Seeing none. Yasmin, can you go to the next screen? So before I mentioned this, I want to really thank Sarah for her presentation. She did a great job. Thank you very much. Great tips. And you could always find additional information in the resources she gave us. So thanks again, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Look forward to working with you and other projects. Next week on September 24th, we have another program, another presentation called Sustainability at the Library, where we'll talk about the new program we have there, where you could check out different kits, different information out to show you how efficient you are at home, or maybe you are really efficient. So please join us on the 24th. Then a little bit before that, also we have on the 22nd this very intriguing, at least to me, a really interesting information here on your quality insulation and energy standards. Here is a little bit more technical. You can see there the folks that are going to be participating, but it helps you explore the different construction assemblies for better insulation and best practices, pitfalls, and solutions. So that one's on September 22nd from noon to 1 o'clock. So thank you again very, very much for joining us. Hope you could join us again, and stay tuned. We'll have more of these great informative webinars in the near future. Thank you.